HOA thought they could lie about a water shortage. Okay, everyone for brown lawns, and then secretly drain the aquifer under my family's land. For years, they preached conservation while their own entrance stayed suspiciously green. They built their whole community on a lie. They just saw me as some old rancher they could push around, a relic of a bygone era they were eager to pave over. They never dreamed I'd find out what they were doing in the dead of night on my own property. And they certainly never figured I'd get my revenge by buying up the senior water rights to the entire basin, leaving them with just a trickle. With the full backing of the law, I basically turned off their water. They wanted to steal my water, so I took it all back. It all started not with a bang, but with a warning notice printed on crisp, offensively cheerful letterhead. An artificial crisis, cooked up by the board of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. Before their identical houses with their sad little saplings popped up, there was just my family's ranch. We've worked this land for 5 generations, since the days when this valley was nothing but open range and oak trees. It's the kind of place where you don't just own the land, you're part of it. The creek that cuts through the south pasture feels like it's in your own veins, its rhythm marking the seasons. This ranch and the water that runs beneath it isn't just property, it's our legacy. Paid for in sweat and hardship and a deep, abiding love for this specific patch of land. Then, about 10 years back, a developer with more money than sense bought the sprawling acreage next door. What felt like overnight, our rolling golden hills were flattened into cul-de-sacs by an army of bulldozers. They called it Lakeside Meadows, a name so cynically aspirational it was almost funny. The lake was a glorified retention pond, lined with black plastic and usually half-empty, reflecting the gray sky like a cataract. With the new neighborhood came an HOA, and with the HOA came the rule book, a 3-ring binder thick enough to stop a door, filled with regulations for every conceivable aspect of human life. At first, it was the usual petty stuff, the kind of nonsense anyone who's lived near an HOA knows all too well. It started small, like death by 1,000 paper cuts. I received a notice because my mailbox, the same heavy steel one my granddad welded and buried 50 years ago, was suddenly a non-conforming shade of black. I was ordered, in no uncertain terms, to paint it a pre-approved, slightly different shade of black. I read the letter, laughed, and tossed it in the burn barrel. A $50 fine appeared a week later, accompanied by a late fee. Then came another letter, this time because the native grasses along our shared fence line, which provided habitat for quail and other wildlife, were a 1/4 inch taller than their manicured turf. Another fine. I was cited for unapproved agricultural odors when the wind blew the wrong way on a day we were moving cattle. The board was led by a woman named Brenda, but after my first and only interaction with her, it was clear to call her President Karen. She'd moved from a big city, chasing some idealized country aesthetic she'd seen in a magazine, but seemed to hate everything actually natural about the place. She patrolled the neighborhood in a spotless white SUV that never saw a speck of dust, wielding her clipboard like a scepter. To her, the world was a list of rules, and anyone who stepped out of line was a problem that needed correction, or better yet, a fine. My ranch wasn't technically part of the HOA, a historical quirk of the property lines that drove Karen absolutely crazy. I was this rogue island of authentic, messy life on the edge of her perfect little kingdom of beige stucco. Since we shared a property line, she tried to exert her imaginary authority over me in any way she could. The fence, the runoff from my pastures during a heavy rain, the dust from my truck on the county road. It was all ammunition for her endless stream of passive-aggressive notices. Then, about 3 years ago, the real trouble kicked off. The HOA declared a water emergency, citing a so-called severe drought. Karen and the board rolled out these draconian water restrictions with an almost gleeful sense of purpose. You could only water your lawn for 15 minutes on Tuesdays between 4 and 6 a.m. Washing your car in your own driveway was forbidden, subject to a fine that could buy you a professional detail. A kiddie pool for your children on a hot summer day could cost you a $500 fine. The neighborhood's once green patches turned to a rust-colored hue and then to brown dust. Everyone's mood soured right along with their landscaping. At the HOA meetings, which I'd occasionally attend to keep an eye on the snakes, Karen would give grand speeches about shared sacrifice and civic duty. "We are all in this together," she'd say, her voice oozing a counterfeit sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Every drop counts. It is our responsibility to our community and to future generations." People grumbled, of course. They complained in hushed tones over their fences and on the neighborhood Facebook group. But ultimately, they went along with it. They paid the fines, which escalated with each supposed infraction, and watched their expensive gardens wither and die. It seemed believable. It's California. Drought is a constant, looming fact of life, but something just felt deeply wrong. I've lived here my whole life. I know the rhythm of this land, the scent of rain before it falls, the feel of the soil in a dry year. My own well, which drew from the same aquifer, was still drawing strongly and clearly. The creek's flow was a little lower than I'd like in the high summer, sure, but it was nothing that screamed unprecedented drought. This didn't feel like a force of nature. It felt like a lie. I started paying more attention, watching with the kind of focused stillness you learn from hunting. I noticed that while everyone else's lawns were crispy and pathetic, the HOA's common areas, the grand entrance with its towering sign, the flower beds around the clubhouse, were suspiciously, vibrantly green. I'd see their contracted landscapers out with water trucks at strange hours, often before dawn. When a brave resident brought it up at a meeting, questioning the double standard, Karen waved it off with practiced ease. The board approved the use of reclaimed water for essential community assets, she explained, the term reclaimed hanging in the air with no definition. It was the kind of corporate doublespeak that means absolutely nothing but is designed to shut down conversation. That slight suspicion started to feel like a knot in my stomach. This wasn't just about rules anymore. They weren't just enforcing policies. They were controlling a vital resource. They were manufacturing a crisis to tighten their grip on the community, and as I'd soon find out, to cover up a much bigger, more audacious secret. The fines were just a bonus, a way to fund their little fiefdom. They weren't conserving water. They were hoarding it. And I was about to find out how. The discovery occurred on a blistering day in late August. During this day, the heat radiates off the ground in visible waves, and the air is thick with the scent of dry grass. I was out on my old ATV, making my rounds to check on a well pump in the south pasture. It's an old agricultural well that we no longer use much, mainly for backup purposes. Still, it sits on an easement that runs right up against the HOA's property line. As I got closer, cutting through the shimmering heat, I heard it. The distinct, relentless hum of a high-capacity pump running flat out. My hand went still on the throttle. That pump hadn't been active in years. I killed the engine and let the ATV coast to a stop. In the sudden silence, the mechanical drone was even louder, an alien sound in the quiet pasture. I got off the bike and my blood ran cold. The scene before me was one of calm, methodical violation. There was a brand-new, commercial-grade power meter connected to the wellhead, its digital display ticking away kilowatts. Fresh tire tracks, not mine, were carved into the dirt. Someone had come onto my property, trespassed with heavy equipment, hooked into my old well, and was pulling a massive criminal amount of water out of the ground. The pump was running straight to a new, hastily buried pipeline that disappeared under the fence and headed directly toward the pristine lawns of lakeside meadows. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it left me floored. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate and calculated large-scale theft. They had trespassed, installed their own industrial equipment on my well, and were secretly draining the very aquifer that fed my ranch, my cattle, and the generational creek that was the lifeblood of this land. All while President Karen stood on her soapbox, preaching about conservation and fining her neighbors for filling a birdbath. The lush clubhouse lawn, the spotless entrance, the ever-full lake, it all made a sickening kind of sense now. They weren't using reclaimed water. They were using my water, stolen straight from under my feet. A white-hot anger flared up in my chest, the kind that makes you want to tear something apart with your bare hands. But I knew, with a certainty born from generations of quiet resilience, that I had to be smart. I suppressed the anger, turning it into a cold resolve. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I documented everything: the new meter, the serial numbers, The hastily dug trench for the pipeline, the unmistakable sound of the pump, making sure to get the property line markers, and the distant roofs of lakeside meadows in the shot. I had my evidence, clear and irrefutable. The next day, I didn't bother to clean up. I walked into the HOA community center, muddy boots and all, the fine dust of the pasture still on my jeans. The air inside was cool and smelled of air freshener. Karen looked up from her desk, her practiced smile vanishing the moment she saw me. "You need to make an appointment," she said, her voice tight, already on the defensive. "No, I don't think I do," I said, my voice quiet and cold. "I didn't raise it. I didn't need to." I walked into her office, shut the door behind me, and put my phone on her polished desk. I played the video of the pump. Her eyes darted to the screen, and for a split second, I saw it. Pure, undiluted panic. But the mask of authority came back on almost instantly. She leaned back in her chair with a theatrical scoff. "I don't know what that is," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's probably just some old equipment. You ranchers leave your junk everywhere." "That junk is draining my aquifer as we speak," I said, leaning forward, my hands flat on her desk. "You're trespassing on my land and stealing my water." The color drained from her face. "That is a baseless and grave accusation," she stammered, but her voice was shaking, betraying her feigned confidence. "Is it?" I pushed. "Then you won't mind if I have the sheriff meet me out there this afternoon while I have that illegal pump disconnected and removed from my private property." That's when the panic turned to aggression. The last resort of a cornered bully. She shot up from her chair, her face flushed with fury. "You will do no such thing. That pump is necessary for the community's water supply. You can't just interfere with essential infrastructure." It was so blatant, so breathtakingly stupid that I almost had to laugh. She was denying it and admitting it in the same breath. She hadn't just confessed. She'd declared the stolen water essential. I left her office without another word and went straight to a lawyer my family had used for decades. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man who understood land and the conflicts that arise from it. He was floored by the video but warned me that fighting an HOA is a war of attrition. They have a war chest funded by the very homeowners they were deceiving. I have my savings. We sent a formal cease and desist letter, a document dripping with legal formality, demanding they stop the illegal pumping immediately, remove their equipment, and compensate me for the water they'd stolen, the value of which was likely in the tens of thousands of dollars. Their lawyer's response arrived a week later. It was a masterclass in corporate arrogance. It denied everything, of course, calling my claims frivolous and unsubstantiated, but then it went even further. They offered me a one-time nuisance payment of $5,000 in exchange for a retroactive shared well agreement. They weren't just denying their theft. They were trying to bully me into making it legal for pennies on the dollar, as if I were some ignorant hick they could buy off. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat. If I were to speak to any of the Lakeside Meadows residents about this dispute, they would likely sue me for slander and tortious interference. They thought they had me backed into a corner. They thought I was just some dumb rancher who would be intimidated by a fancy lawyer's letterhead and take the chump change and shut up. They had just picked a fight with a man who knew his land and its history a lot better than they knew their own bylaws. And they had just given me all the motivation I needed to stop defending my legacy and start attacking their fraudulent little empire. That insulting offer was the last straw. Playing their game of threatening letters and endless soul-crushing paperwork was a rigged match. I knew I had to step outside their system, outside the little box of rules they'd built for themselves, and find a lever of power they didn't even know existed. The aha moment came late one night in the quiet of my father's old office. Surrounded by generations of family history, I was digging through dusty property surveys, brittle land grants from the 1940s, and handwritten ledgers. That's when I found a thick, leather-bound folder, the cover embossed with water rights. My great-grandfather, a man who planned for everything and trusted no one, hadn't just documented our well. He'd meticulously documented the history of the entire watershed. In the arid West, land is one thing, but water rights are everything. They are a separate, ferociously guarded form of property, and those rights are ranked by seniority. First in time, first in right. It means those who first put the water to beneficial use have the primary claim, a right that predates and supersedes all others. The records showed my family's rights were old and solid, established long before anyone dreamed of a lakeside meadows. But crucially, as I delved deeper, I discovered that the HOA, through its developer, was operating on very junior newly acquired rights. Their entire development, with its hundreds of homes and thirsty landscaping, was built on a shaky and insufficient water foundation. Their illegal pumping from my well wasn't just a backup plan. It was a desperate and criminal attempt to supplement their fundamentally inadequate supply. They had knowingly overpromised water to their residents and were now resorting to theft to cover their tracks. A frantic, focused energy took hold of me. This was the weapon I needed. I spent the next 2 days making calls, tracing the chain of water rights ownership up the basin. That's when I heard a rumor, a whisper on the wind from an old contact at the county water agency. A large, defunct agricultural corporation that had owned thousands of acres upstream was getting ready to sell off its assets in a bankruptcy proceeding. And buried in those assets was its block of ancient, top-priority senior water rights for the entire basin, rights even older than my family's. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. A legal loophole big enough to drive a truck through. If I could obtain those rights, I wouldn't just have a claim to the water under my land. I would have a first claim to the surface and groundwater in the entire basin. I could legally force the state to require all junior rights holders, such as the HOA, to stop drawing water so that my senior rights are satisfied first. I wouldn't just be turning off their illegal pump. I'd be turning off their main supply. I immediately called a lawyer who specialized in the complex and often contentious world of Western water rights. He was a grizzled old pro named Miller, a man who spoke in dry, measured tones but had the eyes of a shark. When I laid out the situation, the theft, the arrogant letter, the bankruptcy sale, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Son," he said, the grin audible in his voice, "this is the move they write books about. Let's go hunting." The process was a legal and financial nightmare. We had to move fast, navigating the complexities of bankruptcy court. But Miller was a master. Our biggest hurdle arose when the HOA, likely tipped off by someone at the county or their own legal team, discovered the sale. Suddenly, we were in a bidding war. Karen and the board were using the residents' own money, their HOA dues, and fine payments to try and outbid me for the rights that would give me control over their water supply. The irony was staggering. The fight became my obsession. I liquidated investments my father had set aside. I took out a substantial loan against a piece of the ranch, leveraging the very land I was trying to protect. I pushed all my chips to the center of the table. It was the biggest, most terrifying gamble of my life. If I failed, I'd be financially ruined and at the mercy of the HOA's lawyers. The day the final sealed bids were due was pure torture. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped into my throat. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. The call from Miller finally came just after 5 p.m. as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pasture. "Well," he said, pausing for what felt like an eternity, a dramatic flare I would have hated from anyone else. "Congratulations. You are now the primary senior water rights holder in this valley." Relief washed over me so hard my knees almost buckled. I sat down heavily in my grandfather's old chair. I'd done it. I had won. But the fight wasn't over. The revenge was just getting started. The first thing we did, the very next morning, was file a formal call on the water with the State Water Board. It's a legal petition that is both simple and devastating. It says, "I am the senior rights holder. There is not enough water in this system to satisfy everyone, and I am invoking my priority. You are required by law to tell the junior rights holders to turn off their pumps until my rights are fulfilled." The second thing I did was hire a professional bonded crew. I had them legally and professionally cap and remove every last trace of the illegal pump and pipeline from my property. I had the ground reseeded with native grass. The secret was over, and the evidence of their crime was gone, but the consequence was now barreling towards them. For the next few weeks, things were eerily quiet. I suspect Karen, in her boundless arrogance, thought my legal filing was a bluff, another piece of paper she could bury in court with the residents' money. She underestimated me for the last time. Then the letter from the state arrived at the Lakeside Meadows clubhouse. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a legally binding curtailment order. Effective immediately, they were ordered to dramatically reduce their water withdrawal to a mere fraction of their previous usage, just enough for basic sanitation and fire safety. Miles away at the source of their legal water supply, the pumps would have to be throttled down. The sprinklers would sputter and die. The water pressure in their homes would drop. I hadn't just taken back my water. I had legally taken control of everything. The call I made to Karen's office afterward was brief and to the point. "Check your mail," I said, and hung up before she could respond. The fallout was immediate, spectacular, and exactly as chaotic as you'd imagine. Within the hour, my phone started ringing off the hook. First up was Karen, and she was not screaming threats. She was shrieking them. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, the sound of a petty tyrant whose power had been wholly and abruptly dismantled. I was a monster, a vindictive tyrant, a terrorist who was punishing a whole community of innocent families. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is illegal. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you into oblivion." "It's perfectly legal, Karen," I said calmly, letting the silence on my end of the line amplify her hysteria. "They're called senior water rights. Look it up. You were trespassing and stealing, and now the state has told you to stop. It's that simple. Have your costly lawyer explain it to you." Then the residents started calling. Just as I expected, about half of them were furious with me, their anger expertly directed at me by Karen. I was the bad guy who had cut off their water without warning. They didn't know the whole story and just wanted to be able to take a decent shower and not have their toilets gurgle. I listened patiently to their angry voicemails, knowing the truth would eventually prevail, but the other half were asking questions. They were the ones who'd been suspicious of the board for years, the ones who felt the math never added up. One guy, a retired civil engineer named Tom, who lived a few doors down from the clubhouse, called me directly. "I've been telling my wife for years their numbers didn't add up," he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and anger. "They told us there was a critical shortage. They showed us charts. Was it all a lie?" "Yes," I told him, and then I explained everything. The whole thing was a lie. They were illegally pumping thousands of gallons a day from my property the entire time and charging you for the shortage. The HOA called an emergency town hall meeting for the following night. The email, which a sympathetic neighbor forwarded to me, was a masterpiece of misdirection, painting me as a greedy landowner holding the community hostage for financial gain. The room was packed and simmering with a volatile mix of anger and confusion. Karen stood at the front, flanked by the other board members, as she tried to spin her story. That's when I walked in. I hadn't been invited, but I didn't need an invitation. A hush fell over the room as 100 heads turned to watch me walk down the center aisle. Karen's face went white. "You don't have a right to be here," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "I think I do," I said, my voice carrying easily in the silent room. I was carrying a laptop and a small projector. Since I'm the sole topic of discussion this evening, I figure I have a right to present my side. Before she or the stunned board members could stop me, I had it set up. The first image on the screen was a crystal-clear photo of the illegal pump on my wellhead, the new power meter ticking away. Gasps rippled through the room. I let the image hang there for a moment, then played the video, the sound of the pump filling the room. I showed them the overhead map with the property line markers, clearly indicating the trespass. Then I put up a copy of the cease and desist letter we sent. Finally, I showed them the HOA's official response, the insulting $5,000 offer, and the explicit threat to sue me for slander if I told anyone what was happening. You could have heard a pin drop. The residents were looking from the screen to Karen, their faces twisting from shock to comprehension and then to pure fury. Tom, the engineer, stood up, his face red. "Is this true?" he asked Karen, his voice shaking with rage. "Did you fine us hundreds of dollars for watering our flowers while you were stealing this man's water?" Karen stammered, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her. "It's complicated. We were acting in the community's best interests." "To secure our water supply." "The community's best interests?" another woman yelled from the back. You used our money to fund a crime? Then you lied to our faces about it, and then you tried to use our money again to fight the man you were stealing from. You were fining us for a problem you created." The meeting exploded. It was like a dam breaking. All the anger they'd aimed at me turned right back around and crashed down on Karen and the board. My work was done. I packed up my projector and my laptop, walked back down the aisle, and left them to the fire they'd built. The entire board was forced to resign within a week. Karen, disgraced and ostracized, sold her house at a loss and was gone in a month. The new interim board's first official act was to call me to negotiate. They didn't summon me to their clubhouse. They came to my ranch and sat at my old oak kitchen table, the same table where my great-grandfather had signed the original deed. I laid out my terms. They weren't suggestions. First, a formal public apology to me for the theft and slander, and a separate, detailed apology to the residents for the years of lies and fraudulent fines. Second, the HOA would reimburse me for every single penny of my legal fees and the full purchase price of the senior water rights. Third, they would pay a hefty sum in damages for the water they stole, which I would place into a legally protected trust dedicated to watershed conservation and creek restoration in our valley. Finally, once all those conditions were met, we could talk about a new water-sharing agreement, a legal, transparent, and professionally monitored one, where they would pay a fair market rate for any water they used above their legal allotment. They had no leverage, no other options. They had built their entire community on a stolen resource, and I now owned the rights to it. They agreed to every single term. Today, things are different. The Lakeside Meadows sign is watered on a strict and now very real schedule. The new HOA board operates with a transparency born from the ashes of the old one's deceit. The ridiculous fines are a thing of the past, and I have found myself in a strange new role as the unofficial and unwilling watchdog of our corner of the world. Every time I see the new board working to manage their water responsibly, I think of Karen and her clipboard. They thought their little rule book, their binder of petty tyrannies, meant more than my family's legacy and my property rights. They learned a hard lesson in the most expensive way possible. They tried to steal a little, and in the end they had to answer to me for every last drop. This whole mess taught me that sometimes, when you're pushed, you have to push back harder than you ever thought you could. It taught me that knowledge of your history, your rights, and your opponent's weaknesses is the ultimate power. If you have your own nightmare story with an HOA or a power-tripping board, share it in the comments below. I want to hear it. And if you enjoyed seeing justice served, I'd appreciate it if you could hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Ultimately, it was never just about the water. It was about the principle. It was about a committee in a sterile clubhouse, thinking they could bully a family that had been part of this land for generations. They thought their bylaws, written a few years ago, meant more than my deed, which was signed a century ago. They were wrong. Now they play by a new set of rules, the state's and mine. They wanted a little extra water to keep their entrance green. Now they have to account for every single gallon they use. And as I look out over my land at the creek flowing clear and strong, there's a special kind of satisfaction in that.